The front door had barely stopped echoing when Vincent Calloway stepped across the marble threshold without warning, rain glistening on the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat, and every servant in the mansion lowered their eyes except the quiet waitress who instinctively reached out to stop an antique porcelain tray from slipping off a side table before it shattered at his feet. The tiny sound of china settling back into place lingered longer than anyone's breath. Vincent did not thank her. He simply studied the tray for half a second before continuing inside, his polished shoes leaving dark prints across the white marble floor. Somewhere deeper in the house, a grandfather clock struck 8. Nobody moved until he did. Claire Bennett lowered her hand slowly, almost embarrassed that anyone had noticed. Before she could return the tray to its place, the elderly housekeeper brushed past her with hurried steps and whispered without turning her head, "Never look him in the eyes unless he asks." Claire nodded once. She did not argue. She quietly adjusted the silver spoon that had shifted beside a porcelain cup instead. It rested exactly parallel to the saucer now, a habit so natural she never seemed aware she was doing it. Across the foyer, Vincent paused beneath the enormous staircase. His gaze swept over the portraits lining the walls. Something almost invisible tightened around his expression. A bronze statue near the entrance had been rotated only a few inches. The lilies on the center table had been replaced with white orchids. The scent in the air was different. The house looked identical. It did not feel the same. He removed his leather gloves one finger at a time. "Who approved these changes?" he asked quietly. The estate manager answered too quickly. "Routine maintenance, sir." Vincent looked at him for another silent heartbeat before walking away without another word. Relief spread across several faces, but not Claire's. As she lifted the untouched teacup from the console table, she noticed a faint ring of moisture beneath it that should not have been there. She wiped it away with the edge of her folded cloth, then hesitated. Instead of leaving, she slipped a tiny silver coin she had found beneath the saucer into the pocket of her apron. She did not examine it. She simply kept it. The gesture was so ordinary that no one paid attention. Upstairs, doors opened one after another as staff rushed to prepare rooms that should already have been perfect. Every movement carried the weight of fear rather than duty. Claire followed with fresh linens balanced across her arms. Passing the landing, she saw Vincent standing alone before a framed family photograph. His reflection in the glass looked older than the man himself. For a brief moment, his fingers almost reached toward the frame. They stopped a fraction short before folding behind his back instead. Claire looked away first. Not because she had been warned, but because the hesitation belonged to him, and she instinctively protected it. She continued walking as though she had seen nothing. A few minutes later, one of the younger footmen stumbled while carrying a crystal decanter. Claire shifted without thinking, catching both the boy and the glass before either hit the floor. The frightened servant whispered, "Thank you." She answered with only a faint smile. The delay cost her. The head butler noticed she had arrived late with the linens and quietly reassigned her evening break to another employee without explanation. Claire accepted the decision with a small nod, folded the unused napkin she had been saving for herself, and slipped it back into the service cart untouched. She said nothing. As the mansion settled into an uneasy rhythm, Vincent crossed into the private dining room. His chair had already been pulled back. The place setting was flawless. Yet he remained standing. His eyes rested on the polished table long enough for everyone present to become uncomfortable. "Who prepared this room?" Silence answered him. The estate manager looked toward the senior staff. Nobody spoke. Claire was already halfway to the doorway carrying an empty tray when Vincent's voice stopped the room. "You." She turned. "Did you set this table?" Every eye shifted toward her. She could have denied it. It would have ended there. Instead, after the smallest pause, she placed the tray gently on the sideboard and met his gaze for the first time. "No, sir," she said softly. "But if you'll allow me, I'd like to prepare it again." Vincent did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough for everyone else to lower their heads again, but Claire remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the sideboard instead of clasped together in nervous apology. At last, Vincent stepped away from the dining table. "Then prepare it," he said. No one expected him to leave the room. Yet he did, disappearing into the library while the estate manager frowned with visible irritation. "You heard Mr. Calloway," the manager muttered sharply. "Do not make him regret it." Claire simply nodded and began clearing the flawless arrangement that someone else had spent hours completing. She did not move quickly. She moved carefully. Every plate shifted by less than an inch. Every piece of silver reflected the chandelier at the same angle. When she reached the center of the table, her hand paused over a crystal bowl. Instead of placing it back where it had been, she moved it slightly toward the window. The adjustment was almost invisible. The room suddenly felt balanced. An elderly maid watching from the doorway blinked in surprise but said nothing. As Claire reached for the folded linen napkins, something slipped quietly from beneath one of them onto the polished wood. The same small silver coin she had tucked into her apron earlier. She frowned almost imperceptibly. She was certain she had left it in her pocket. Without drawing attention, she picked it up again and placed it beside her folded service cloth instead. A few minutes later, Vincent returned. He stopped at the threshold before crossing into the room. His eyes traveled over the table once, then again, slower this time. Nothing appeared dramatically different. Even so, the tension around his shoulders eased by the smallest degree. "Who taught you this?" he asked without looking directly at her. Claire adjusted a water glass until it lined perfectly with the plate. "Someone who believed people deserve to feel welcome before they feel impressed." Vincent's gaze lifted toward her at last. It was not agreement that appeared in his face. It was curiosity. Before he could speak again, the estate manager stepped between them carrying a ledger. "Sir, your evening appointments have been confirmed." Vincent accepted the book without opening it. His attention remained on the table. The interruption lingered awkwardly until Claire quietly lifted the empty tray and stepped back, giving both men the space they expected. The simple gesture dissolved the moment before it became uncomfortable, but it also ended the first conversation either of them had intended to continue. As dinner preparations resumed, one of the younger kitchen assistants hurried into the room carrying a heavy serving dish. His hands shook. He nearly collided with the estate manager, who immediately snapped at him in front of everyone. "If you cannot carry one plate without trembling, you should not be here." The young man froze, unable to answer. Claire looked from the frightened assistant to the untouched place setting before making a choice that cost her again. She set down her own polishing cloth, walked over, and silently took the heavier dish from his hands while giving him the lighter tray instead. The exchange lasted only seconds. The assistant exhaled with visible relief. The estate manager noticed everything. "Miss Bennet," he said coldly, "you seem very interested in telling my staff how to do their jobs." Claire met neither accusation nor anger with resistance. "Only trying to make sure dinner reaches the table safely." The answer was respectful, but it did not satisfy him. "After service, report to me. Your duties will be reassigned." Several servants glanced toward her with quiet sympathy. Claire merely inclined her head and carried the dish the rest of the way herself. Vincent had watched the exchange from the opposite doorway without anyone realizing it. He said nothing. Yet when dinner was finally served, he waited until the frightened young assistant had finished pouring water before dismissing everyone except Claire with a slight movement of his hand. The room emptied. Neither of them spoke immediately. Vincent looked down at the folded linen beside his plate. Claire had embroidered nothing. Added nothing. Yet the corner had been folded into a simple shape he had not seen in many years. His fingers rested lightly against it before he unfolded it with unusual care. He looked toward Claire. She offered no explanation because she had none to give. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. It felt uncertain. "Leave the coffee after dinner," Vincent said quietly. "Serve it yourself." It was a small instruction. Inside this house, it changed everything. Claire understood that accepting meant stepping closer to a man every other servant tried desperately to avoid. Refusing would preserve her safety but erase the fragile trust that had begun to form. After the briefest pause, she lowered her head once. "Yes, sir." Claire accepted the tray of fresh coffee without a word. The porcelain cup rested on its saucer with quiet precision, the silver spoon aligned exactly as she had arranged every table that evening. Before leaving the pantry, she stopped for the briefest moment. The aroma reached her first. It was darker than before, carrying a faint bitterness that had not been present in the beans prepared earlier. She did not replace the coffee. She simply picked up a second empty cup and placed it beneath the folded service cloth on her tray. No one questioned the choice. As she crossed the corridor toward the private dining room, she noticed muddy prints near a side entrance where the marble floor had already been cleaned. They were fresh. They stopped halfway down the hallway instead of leading outside. Claire slowed for one step, then continued as though she had seen nothing. When she entered, Vincent was standing beside the window instead of sitting at the table. Rain blurred the gardens beyond the glass. He turned only after hearing the porcelain touch the polished wood. "You noticed something," he said quietly. It was not a question. Claire glanced toward the cup before looking back at him. "The house feels different to everyone tonight," she answered. "Some people are pretending it does not." Vincent watched her for a long second. She had not accused anyone. She had not offered a theory. She had only acknowledged what everyone else avoided saying aloud. Before he could respond, the estate manager entered carrying a folder. His eyes immediately settled on Claire. "Leave the coffee and return to the kitchen." Vincent did not move. "She stays until I finish." The manager hesitated only briefly before forcing a polite nod. "Of course, sir." He left with the door closing more firmly than necessary. The room grew quiet again. Claire poured the coffee into the waiting cup but stopped just before handing it over. A faint stain marked the inside rim of the porcelain, almost invisible beneath the steam. Instead of pretending not to see it, she reached for the second empty cup she had quietly carried with her and poured the coffee into that one instead. "This cup is clean," she said softly. Vincent looked from one cup to the other. Most people would have ignored that. Claire set the stained cup aside. "Most people are not the ones drinking it." A silence followed that felt unexpectedly human. Vincent accepted the fresh cup without taking his eyes off her. For the first time that evening, he drank immediately. It was a small gesture, but trust had moved one careful step forward. Claire lifted the stained cup to remove it from the table. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the handle before relaxing again. She carried it away without complaint, quietly accepting the extra work created by someone else's carelessness. Vincent noticed the gesture even if she believed he had not. As she turned toward the door, something caught her attention near the fireplace. A framed photograph on the mantel sat at a slight angle compared with the dust line beneath it. Earlier, upstairs, another framed photograph had also seemed subtly disturbed. Claire's eyes lingered for only an instant before she gently straightened this one as she passed. She neither examined the picture nor mentioned it. Vincent saw the movement. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Claire rested her fingertips lightly against the frame before letting go. "Because someone else moved it." Vincent looked at the restored photograph. He did not ask how she knew. Instead, he looked toward the fireplace, then around the room, as though seeing familiar walls through unfamiliar eyes. His curiosity deepened, but so did his caution. If she noticed details this easily, what else had she already seen? Before either could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed outside. The estate manager appeared at the doorway with forced composure. "Sir, one of the security supervisors has requested that tomorrow's patrol routes be changed immediately." Vincent frowned slightly. "Without consulting me?" He insisted it was more efficient. Claire remained still beside the door. The muddy footprints. The moved photographs. The altered coffee cup. None of them proved anything. Yet together they formed a pattern of carelessness someone wanted everyone else to overlook. She could remain silent and preserve her place in the household, or she could speak and risk becoming the servant who questioned decisions far above her station. Vincent noticed her hesitation before she said a word. "Miss Bennet," he said calmly, "if you believe something deserves my attention, say it now." Claire let the silence breathe for one measured heartbeat before answering. "I noticed small things that do not belong together," she said. Fresh footprints where the floor was already cleaned. A coffee cup that should not have been served. 2 family photographs moved just enough that someone familiar with this house would recognize the difference. None of those things prove anything. Together, they tell me people have stopped paying attention. Vincent listened without interrupting. She had offered observations instead of accusations, leaving him the responsibility of judgment. The restraint mattered more than the details themselves. The estate manager remained in the doorway, his expression carefully controlled. "Sir, with respect, the household has been under unusual pressure since your unexpected return. Staff make mistakes." Claire lowered her eyes toward the polished floor rather than defending herself. "They do," she said quietly. "That is why I chose not to accuse anyone." The answer eased the tension instead of feeding it. For a brief moment, the room became less about suspicion and more about responsibility. Vincent walked to the fireplace and gently adjusted the restored photograph with one fingertip, almost unconsciously checking whether it still rested exactly where Claire had placed it. His hand lingered against the frame a fraction longer than necessary before dropping away. Claire noticed the hesitation but respectfully looked elsewhere. She had glimpsed something private and chose not to claim it. That single act of restraint altered the space between them more than another conversation could have. Vincent turned toward the estate manager. "Leave us." The manager hesitated. "Sir." Vincent's voice remained calm. "That was not a request." The door closed behind him. The mansion suddenly felt quieter than before. Vincent crossed to a cabinet and removed a worn leather key case, selecting one small brass key unlike the others. He did not hand it to Claire. Instead, he placed it on the table between them. "Every evening," he said, "my study is prepared before I begin work. The room is never locked while I am inside, but it is locked when I leave. Starting tonight, you will prepare it yourself." Claire looked at the key without reaching for it. It was not a reward. It was responsibility. Accepting meant entering the one place in the house where trust mattered more than perfection. Refusing meant remaining safely invisible. She understood the cost before making the choice. "If I accept," she said softly, "I become responsible for everything inside that room." Vincent gave the smallest nod. "Exactly." She finally picked up the key. Its cool weight settled into her palm beside the small silver coin already hidden in her apron pocket. For an instant, Her thumb brushed both pieces of metal before she closed her hand. Neither of them noticed how naturally the gesture came. The hidden connection quietly deepened without explanation. Before another word could be spoken, a knock sounded at the half-open door. The estate manager returned with controlled urgency. "Sir, the security supervisor has already changed tomorrow's patrol assignments. He says the orders cannot be reversed tonight." Vincent's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Someone had acted before receiving permission. Instead of reacting immediately, he looked toward Claire. She had earned the chance to step into his world, and within moments that chance was already becoming dangerous. "Then tomorrow begins earlier than planned," Vincent said. "Miss Bennet, prepare my study now. When you finish, you will remain nearby until I dismiss you." It was the first responsibility no ordinary waitress would ever be given, and the first one that quietly closed every path back to the life she had known only hours before. Claire slipped the brass key into her apron beside the silver coin, met Vincent's eyes with calm resolve, and answered with the same quiet dignity that had brought her this far. "Yes, sir." Claire unlocked the study with the brass key exactly as Vincent had instructed. She entered alone, carrying nothing except fresh stationery, a clean fountain pen, and the untouched discipline that seemed to follow her into every room. She did not inspect the shelves or admire the paintings. She simply restored order where routine demanded it. A chair stood a few inches away from the desk. She centered it. A reading lamp pointed slightly too high. She lowered it until its light fell naturally across the leather writing surface. Near the corner of the desk lay a framed photograph resting almost imperceptibly out of line with the edge of the blotter. Claire straightened it without lifting the frame, then quietly stepped back. When Vincent entered several minutes later, he stopped before saying a word. Nothing dramatic had changed. Yet the room felt as though someone had remembered the man who worked there rather than the man everyone feared. His eyes settled on the photograph. For the first time that evening, he picked it up instead of merely looking at it. His thumb rested briefly along the worn edge of the frame before he returned it to the desk with unexpected care. Claire lowered her gaze, giving him the privacy of silence instead of the discomfort of being witnessed. That small mercy lingered between them longer than conversation could have. Vincent crossed to the desk and noticed the brass key resting beside the neatly folded service cloth. "You left it," he said. Claire answered without moving. "It belongs to the room, not to me." He looked at her for a long moment. Most people would have carried the key as proof they had been trusted. She had left it behind because she understood trust was a responsibility, not a possession. Something in Vincent's expression softened before caution returned to reclaim it. "Who taught you to think that way?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated for the first time since entering the study. Her fingers brushed the edge of her apron where the small silver coin remained hidden. Someone who believed discipline should protect people, not impress them. She offered nothing more. She never mentioned a name, a place, or a title. Yet the answer carried the weight of a life built long before she ever served coffee in this house. Vincent did not press further. He simply nodded once, as though recognizing that some histories earned respect precisely because they were not offered freely. Outside the study, hurried voices echoed through the corridor. The estate manager appeared at the open doorway, composed but noticeably strained. "Sir, tomorrow's revised security schedule has already been distributed. The supervisor insists changing it again will create confusion among the guards." Vincent remained silent for a moment. Claire watched neither man. Her attention stayed on the desk where a single sheet of paper had shifted slightly beneath an open ledger, likely disturbed by the draft when the door opened. Without interrupting the conversation, she placed a paperweight over it before the page curled further. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet it prevented an important document from slipping to the floor unnoticed. Vincent saw it. The manager did as well. One regarded it as quiet competence. The other saw a servant becoming increasingly present in places she had never belonged. "Miss Bennet," the manager said evenly, "the kitchen is short-handed. Your duties there are being reassigned because of your new responsibilities. Some of the staff are not pleased." It sounded practical. It was also a warning. Claire understood immediately. By accepting Vincent's trust, she had quietly stepped away from the people who had worked beside her only that morning. She could apologize, retreat, and reclaim the comfort of anonymity, or she could accept that every act of responsibility carried the loneliness of standing apart. She bowed her head respectfully. "Please tell them I did not ask for this." It was not a defense. It was an acknowledgement of the cost. Vincent looked at her differently than he had only hours before. Until that moment, he had seen an unusually observant waitress. Now he saw someone who accepted isolation without asking another person to carry it for her. The realization changed him more than any explanation could have. He reached toward the brass key on the desk, then stopped. Instead of taking it back, he gently pushed it across the polished leather toward Claire. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You will need it again tomorrow." The key did not represent privilege anymore. It represented a life she could no longer quietly leave behind. Claire closed her hand around the brass key, feeling the cool edge of the hidden silver coin touch it inside her apron. For the first time, the two pieces of metal rested together, and although neither of them understood why that simple sensation felt strangely familiar, both knew that from this moment forward, protecting the trust growing between them would matter more than protecting the safety they had each lived with before. The brass key had barely disappeared into Claire's apron when the lights flickered once. Then the study fell into silence. The lamps did not fail completely, but the brief interruption was enough to make Vincent look toward the windows instead of the papers on his desk. Outside, rain continued to wash across the dark gardens. Inside, every servant in the hallway seemed to stop breathing at the same moment. Claire waited without speaking. She had learned that the first reaction after an unexpected change often revealed more than the change itself. It did. The estate manager appeared almost immediately. "Sir, one of the exterior circuits has gone down. Maintenance believes it is weather-related." Vincent did not answer. His attention shifted instead to the wall clock. It had stopped for exactly 43 seconds before beginning again. "Has that happened before?" he asked. "Not to my knowledge." Claire quietly looked toward the study door. The hallway beyond remained empty, yet the house no longer carried its usual rhythm. Staff who normally crossed the corridor every few minutes had vanished. Someone had altered the routine without announcing it. She could remain beside Vincent exactly as instructed, honoring the responsibility he had entrusted to her, or she could step outside long enough to understand why the house suddenly felt hollow. Both choices protected something valuable. Neither was free. Vincent noticed her hesitation before she moved. "Go," he said calmly. "See what everyone else has stopped seeing." Claire inclined her head once and slipped into the corridor. The farther she walked, the quieter the mansion became. Fresh polish still scented the banisters, yet one side table remained untouched after evening service. A hallway lamp had been turned toward the wall instead of the staircase. A pantry door stood half open, though the kitchen staff always closed it before dinner ended. None of the details meant danger alone. Together they carried the same uneasy imbalance she had sensed since Vincent returned home. Near the rear corridor, she found the young kitchen assistant she had helped earlier sitting alone on a service stool, staring at an empty tray with trembling hands. He immediately stood when he saw her. "They moved me," he whispered. "They said Mr. Calloway wants different people on every floor tonight." Claire knew Vincent had given no such instruction. She also saw the fear in the young man's face. Correcting him might calm one misunderstanding while placing him in conflict with his supervisors. Remaining silent would leave him carrying a burden he did not deserve. She chose the person before the position. "Do your work carefully," she said gently. "Do not worry about explaining yourself tonight." The young assistant nodded with visible relief. The kindness lasted only a moment before footsteps approached. The estate manager rounded the corner, his expression unreadable. "Miss Bennet," he said evenly, "your responsibility is the study, not the staff." Claire answered with the same composure she had always carried. He needed direction. He needed discipline. Their eyes met only briefly. Neither raised a voice. Yet the distance between them widened. The manager had made his move without accusing her directly. Every act of compassion she offered now became evidence that she was stepping beyond her place. Claire accepted the cost without defending herself. When she returned to the study, Vincent was standing where she had left him, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk. He looked more tired than before, though nothing in his posture invited sympathy. Claire quietly placed the brass key on the desk beside him. "I left only because you asked me to." Vincent glanced at the key, then gently closed her fingers around it instead of taking it back. The gesture lasted only a second. It was enough. "If I ask again," he said softly, "keep it with you." For the first time, the responsibility belonged not merely to the room but to the trust between them. Claire nodded. The hidden silver coin shifted against the brass key inside her apron as she lowered her hand, the familiar touch of metal against metal grounding a choice that had already begun changing who she was. Before either of them could speak again, the estate manager returned once more. His voice remained respectful, but his words left no room for retreat. "Sir, because tomorrow's patrol changes are already in effect, I have reassigned access throughout the house. From this moment forward, anyone carrying a key to the private rooms will be personally accountable for anything that happens inside them." The statement landed heavily in the silence. Vincent understood the challenge immediately. So did Claire. Keeping the key now protected the trust Vincent had placed in her. Returning it would protect her own safety and reputation. Either value deserved to survive. Neither could survive untouched. Vincent said nothing. He simply waited. After one quiet breath, Claire closed her hand around the brass key instead of setting it down. The decision could not be undone, and in that instant the greatest danger was no longer what might happen inside the mansion. It was what both of them were now willing to lose rather than betray the trust that had begun to grow between them. Night settled over the estate with a silence so complete that the absence of ordinary sounds became louder than any alarm. Claire had barely stepped into the main corridor when every light beyond the central staircase went dark. A heartbeat later, the emergency lamps glowed dimly, leaving long shadows across polished floors that had reflected certainty only hours before. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy door closed. Not slammed. Deliberately closed. Vincent emerged from his study almost at the same moment, the brass key still resting safely inside Claire's apron. Neither of them spoke. They no longer needed many words to recognize the same change. The house itself no longer belonged to its routines. Claire looked toward the staircase instead of the nearest exit. Earlier that evening she had noticed the altered patrol assignments, the moved photographs, the disturbed hallways, and the subtle changes no one else considered important. Those choices now converged into one unavoidable conclusion. "The family wing," she said quietly. Vincent followed her eyes. He understood immediately. If someone had redirected security, the safest rooms had become the most exposed. They moved without running. Panic would spread faster than danger if the household saw it. At the top of the stairs, Claire paused beside a narrow service corridor that most guests never noticed. She reached for the concealed latch and quietly secured the passage from the inside before continuing forward. It was not a dramatic act. It simply removed one unseen route through the house. Vincent watched her hands with growing respect. "How did you know about that door?" he asked. Claire answered while checking the lock with calm precision. "Old houses always keep a second way in." She offered nothing more. It was experience, not mystery, that guided her. Together they reached the family corridor. One frightened housemaid stood outside a bedroom, clutching a blanket with trembling hands. Claire slowed immediately. Instead of rushing past, she gently placed a reassuring hand over the woman's shaking fingers before taking the blanket herself and wrapping it around the shoulders of an elderly family member waiting just inside the doorway. Only after seeing the older woman safely seated did Claire step back into the hallway. The delay cost precious seconds, but it reminded everyone present that people mattered more than perfect plans. Vincent saw the choice. So did the terrified staff. The trust around Claire no longer came from her observations. It came from the way she carried other people's fear without adding to it. Their brief relief ended as quickly as it arrived. The estate manager appeared at the far end of the corridor with several security guards behind him. His face remained composed, but his instructions came too quickly. "Mr. Calloway, the safest route is downstairs. We need everyone moved immediately." Claire looked past him. The guards stood where tomorrow's revised patrol plan would have placed them, not where tonight's original protection should have been. The pattern finally became impossible to ignore. She did not accuse him. She simply looked at Vincent. He understood what her silence meant. The manager's greatest advantage had always been Vincent's confidence in the system he controlled. That confidence had become the source of tonight's crisis. Vincent now faced a choice no leader should ever have to make. He could preserve the authority of the household by obeying the structure he had trusted for years, or he could trust the judgment of one quiet waitress whose only evidence had always been discipline, restraint, and compassion. Both values deserved protection. Only one could survive this moment. Claire recognized the impossible weight of the decision before he spoke. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "If you choose them," she said gently, "I will still do everything I can." Vincent looked at her, and for the first time since returning home, the control that had defined him revealed a small fracture. His hand tightened briefly around the back of a nearby chair before releasing it again. He did not want to gamble the safety of his family on instinct. He also could no longer pretend Claire's judgment had been luck. The silence between them carried every choice they had made since he crossed the front door. Then he made the one decision neither of them could ever take back. He turned away from the estate manager and spoke only to Claire. "Lead them." The corridor fell still. Authority had shifted without a raised voice. Claire accepted neither triumph nor recognition. She simply nodded once, gathered the frightened family members behind her, and guided them toward the secured service passage she had protected minutes earlier. Behind them, the estate manager remained motionless. His careful plan had not collapsed, but it had changed. Vincent had chosen a person over the system that had served him for years. As the hidden door closed between the two groups, Claire felt the brass key and the small silver coin pressed together once more inside her apron. She did not look back. Neither did Vincent. "Trust changes everything," he said softly. "Including what it costs." And as the concealed passage disappeared into darkness, both of them understood that whatever waited on the other side, there was no path back to the people they had been before that choice. Claire guided the frightened family through the narrow service passage without once looking back. Every few steps she paused, not because she doubted the route, but because she refused to leave anyone behind. When the elderly woman stumbled on the uneven stone floor, Claire stopped the entire line, adjusted the blanket more securely around her shoulders, and waited until the older woman found her footing again. The delay was dangerous. It was also the only choice Claire could live with. Vincent watched from the rear, no longer measuring time only by strategy but by the people depending on it. The hidden passage opened into a quiet storage room on the opposite side of the estate. The family was safe. For the first time that night, no one spoke. The silence itself became a gift. Claire removed the brass key from her apron and placed it gently on a nearby table, believing her responsibility had ended the moment everyone reached safety. As her hand withdrew, the small silver coin slipped free beside it. The two pieces of metal came to rest against one another with a soft, unmistakable sound. Vincent's eyes settled on them immediately. He did not reach for either object. Instead, he looked at Claire. She instinctively picked up the coin first, then the key, exactly as she had done every time they had touched before. It was never about their value. It was always the order. She quietly tucked the coin away before lifting the key again. Vincent understood something long before he understood why. Every decision she had made since his return had followed the same quiet principle. She protected people before possessions. Responsibility before recognition. The coin had never been a clue. The key had never been the reward. Together they revealed the person she had always been. Claire looked toward him with the same calm dignity she had carried from the first moment they met. She did not explain herself. She simply held out the brass key. Vincent did not take it. Instead, he gently closed her fingers around it once more. The gesture transformed everything they had shared. The key no longer represented access to a room. It represented his willingness to entrust another human being with the burdens he had carried alone for years. Before either of them could speak, hurried footsteps echoed outside the storage room. The young kitchen assistant appeared, breathing hard. He looked first at Claire, then at Vincent. "Everyone made it," he whispered with visible relief. They followed her. The words were simple. They carried more weight than praise ever could. Vincent turned toward the doorway where the estate manager finally arrived, alone. He stopped after seeing the family safe together and the household gathered around the one waitress he had repeatedly tried to push back into the shadows. No accusation was spoken. None was needed. Every decision he had made throughout the evening had quietly separated him from the trust of the people around him, while every difficult choice Claire had made had drawn them closer together. His authority had begun to collapse under the weight of his own priorities. Vincent looked at Claire once again. The woman he had first seen as a quiet waitress now stood before him as someone who had never tried to earn importance, only responsibility. That realization changed him more completely than any confession ever could. "Who are you?" he asked softly. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again. "Just someone who noticed." The answer carried no pride and sought no recognition. It simply completed every quiet choice she had made since the front door first opened. Vincent gave the smallest nod, not because he had learned everything about her, but because he no longer needed to. The person standing before him had already shown him the only truth that mattered. He stepped aside instead of ahead, silently inviting Claire to lead the family out first. It was the first time in years anyone had seen Vincent Calloway surrender precedence to another person. Claire hesitated for only a heartbeat, accepting not the honor but the responsibility it carried, and walked forward. As she passed, the brass key rested securely in her hand while the silver coin remained hidden against her heart, no longer connected by mystery but by the quiet promise they had come to represent together. Trust was never given by power, only earned through sacrifice. Behind them, the estate itself seemed strangely still, its greatest conflict already ending not because someone had won, but because two people had chosen to become different than they had been when the night began. Yet as they reached the final doorway leading back into the morning light, Vincent stopped, looked toward Claire once more, and waited for one last decision that would define not the house they had saved, but the life they would choose after leaving it behind. Morning light spilled through the mansion's front entrance, touching the same marble floor where Vincent Calloway had walked in alone the night before. The silence was no longer heavy. It was earned. Servants moved carefully through the foyer, restoring overturned chairs, polishing railings, and returning familiar order to the house, yet something invisible had changed. No one lowered their eyes because they were afraid. They lowered them out of quiet respect for the people beside them. Claire stood near the entrance holding the brass key one last time. She wiped it clean with the same folded service cloth she had carried throughout the night before placing it gently on the entrance table where Vincent could see it. The small silver coin remained in her apron pocket. It stayed with her because it had never belonged to the house. The key had. Vincent approached without hurry. For a long moment he looked at the key instead of reaching for it. When he finally lifted it, he did not place it back inside the leather case with the others. Instead, he rested it beside the porcelain tray Claire had stopped from falling when he first entered the mansion. The tray had become just another piece of china again. The key had become something else entirely. Claire quietly prepared one final cup of coffee. As always, she aligned the spoon with the saucer before carrying it across the room. She paused beside Vincent and placed the cup before him without ceremony. This time he noticed the tiny details before she stepped away. The angle of the cup. The folded napkin. The quiet invitation for another person to feel welcome before feeling impressed. He gave the faintest smile, almost too small to exist, and lifted the cup without inspecting it first. The man who had questioned everything now accepted the gesture because he trusted the hands that offered it. Nearby, the young kitchen assistant entered carrying a breakfast tray. Halfway across the foyer, he noticed a frightened new maid struggling beneath a stack of heavy linens. Without being asked, he set down his own tray, took the heavier bundle from her arms, and exchanged it for the lighter one exactly as Claire had once done for him. She watched from across the room but said nothing. The kindness needed no acknowledgement. It had already found its next home. The estate manager crossed the foyer as well, no longer issuing hurried instructions. He quietly handed Vincent an updated ledger before stepping back without expecting immediate approval. Consequences had settled where authority once stood. The house itself had begun choosing discipline over control. Vincent turned toward Claire. Hours earlier he would have thanked her with money, promotion, or privilege. The man standing there now chose something entirely different. From today, he said quietly, no one speaks to Miss Bennet without speaking to me first. No applause followed. No servant reacted aloud. Yet every face in the foyer reflected the same quiet understanding. Claire had not risen because she demanded recognition. She had changed the measure by which everyone else recognized one another. Claire lowered her head with the same humility she had carried from the beginning. She did not step closer to power. She simply resumed collecting empty cups from the breakfast table, exactly as she would have done on any ordinary morning. The work had not changed. She had. So had the man watching her. Vincent walked to the front door and opened it himself. Rain had disappeared, leaving only clear morning air. He waited. Claire approached, pausing beside him. For an instant, the brass key rested in his palm while the small silver coin rested unseen against her heart. Neither object completed the story. The choices they had witnessed did. Claire stepped through the doorway first. Vincent followed one quiet pace behind, not because he had surrendered his strength, but because he had discovered a stronger way to use it. Behind them, The front door closed with the same gentle echo that had opened the story, yet nothing inside the house remained the same. On the entrance table, the porcelain tray stood exactly where Claire had steadied it on the first night, untouched, balanced, and waiting for whoever entered next to discover that the quietest hands sometimes leave the deepest mark.